On the morning of March 17, 1967, Helen Martinez walked into Building 4 at NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, carrying a box of freshly baked empanadas for her colleague's birthday celebration. The humid Texas air already promised another sweltering day, and the fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as she made her way through corridors filled with engineers and scientists racing against the Soviets to put a man on the moon. Helen believed this would be just another ordinary Tuesday, filled with typing memos and filing reports for Dr. Werner Kellerman, the senior aerospace engineer who headed the Apollo Propulsion Systems division. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever to penetrate America's space program, and that by sunset, the entire trajectory of the space race would shift in ways that intelligence analysts would still be studying decades later. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Helen Martinez had worked as a secretary at NASA for 3 years, a position she secured after graduating from the University of Houston with a degree in business administration. At 26 years old, she was one of the younger support staff members in a facility that buzzed with the energy of America's most ambitious technological endeavor. Her parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was 5, and her father often reminded her that working for NASA meant she was contributing to something greater than herself. The Cold War wasn't just headlines in newspapers. It was the backdrop to every decision, every calculation, and every midnight oil burned by the men and women trying to beat the Soviet Union to the lunar surface. Dr. Werner Kellerman had joined NASA 2 years before Helen, transferring from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. He was 43, with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a perpetually thoughtful appearance. His background was impressive: a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT, previous work on ballistic missile systems, and a reputation for solving problems that left other engineers scratching their heads. He spoke with a faint accent that he attributed to his childhood in Pennsylvania, where his German immigrant parents had settled after World War II. His colleagues respected him immensely, and Helen found him to be a demanding but fair supervisor who always remembered to thank her for her work. The empanadas Helen carried that morning were for Betty Thornton, another secretary who worked 2 doors down and was celebrating her 30th birthday. Helen had spent the previous evening preparing them, using her grandmother's recipe, carefully folding the masa around spiced beef and potatoes. The smell wafting from the box made her stomach rumble as she approached Dr. Kellerman's office to drop off her purse before heading to Betty's desk. She noticed his door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. He typically arrived before anyone else and kept his door closed until precisely 8 o'clock, when he would emerge for his first coffee of the day. Helen pushed the door open with her hip, calling out a cheerful good morning, expecting to find him hunched over blueprints or technical specifications. Instead, she found the office empty, but something immediately struck her as wrong. The filing cabinet in the corner stood open, which violated strict NASA security protocols. All classified materials were supposed to be locked away when an office was unoccupied, even for a moment. Papers were scattered across Dr. Kellerman's desk in a pattern that seemed hurried, not his usual meticulous organization. His coffee mug sat cold and full on the windowsill, as if he'd poured it and then forgotten it entirely. Helen set the empanadas down on a chair and approached the filing cabinet. Her heart quickened as she noticed that the drawer labeled Apollo Propulsion Systems, classified, was pulled out, folders tilted at odd angles. She shouldn't look, she knew. This was Dr. Kellerman's business, and he'd probably just been called away to an urgent meeting. But something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She glanced at the folders, not touching them, simply reading the visible tabs. Most were technical documents she'd filed herself over the past months: fuel mixture calculations, combustion chamber specifications, thrust vector analyses. Then she saw something that made her freeze. Tucked between 2 folders was a thin manila envelope that didn't belong to NASA's standard filing system. It had no label, no classification marking, no identification number. Helen knew the filing protocols by heart. She'd been trained extensively on proper document handling. Every piece of paper that entered or left this office was supposed to be logged, marked, and tracked. This envelope existed outside that system, like a ghost. She heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly stepped back from the cabinet, her pulse hammering. Dr. Kellerman appeared in the doorway, and for just a fraction of a second, his expression flickered with something Helen had never seen before. Alarm. It vanished so quickly she almost thought she'd imagined it, replaced by his usual warm smile. "Good morning, Helen," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You're here early today." Helen gestured to the empanadas. "Betty's birthday," she explained, then nodded toward the filing cabinet. "I noticed this was open. I didn't touch anything, but I thought you'd want to know. Security, you know." Dr. Kellerman's smile didn't waver, but Helen noticed his hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his briefcase. "Of course," he said, moving past her to close the cabinet. "I was reviewing some documents first thing this morning and must have been distracted by a phone call. Thank you for being vigilant." He locked the cabinet with a small key from his pocket and turned to face her fully. His eyes, magnified slightly behind his glasses, studied her face for a moment longer than necessary. Helen felt a strange chill despite the building's warm air. She picked up the empanadas, suddenly eager to leave. "I'll just be going to Betty's desk now," she said. "Do you need anything before I start on today's typing?" No, Dr. Kellerman replied, settling into his chair. "Just the usual correspondence. I have a meeting at 9 with the propulsion team, so I'll need those notes transcribed by this afternoon." Helen left, but the uneasy feeling followed her down the hallway like a shadow. She tried to shake it off as she joined Betty and the other secretaries for a small celebration, but even as she laughed at jokes and watched Betty blow out the single candle on a store-bought cake, her mind kept circling back to that unlabeled envelope and the strange look in Dr. Kellerman's eyes. The rest of the morning passed in routine fashion. Helen typed memos, answered phone calls, and organized Dr. Kellerman's schedule. He emerged from his office at 9 for his meeting, nodding pleasantly to her as he passed. She noticed he carried a leather portfolio under his arm, which wasn't unusual. Engineers were always carrying documents between meetings, though protocol required them to log classified materials out of their offices. She made a mental note to check the log later, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. At lunch, Helen sat with Betty and 2 other secretaries in the cafeteria, where the conversation inevitably turned to the upcoming Apollo missions. Everyone at NASA felt the pressure of President Kennedy's deadline, even though he'd been dead for more than 3 years. His promise to put a man on the moon before the decade's end had become a national obsession, a way to prove American superiority over the Soviets, who had embarrassed the country with Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin. "Do you think we'll really make it?" Betty asked, stirring sugar into her iced tea. "Before 1970? "We have to," another secretary named Patricia replied firmly. "Can you imagine if the Russians get there first, after everything we've invested?" Helen listened but didn't contribute much. Her mind kept drifting back to the morning's strange encounter. She decided she was being paranoid, letting Cold War anxieties color normal events. Dr. Kellerman was one of the most trusted engineers at NASA. He'd passed extensive background checks, had security clearance that took months to obtain, and had never given anyone reason to doubt his loyalty. The unlabeled envelope was probably just a personal document, maybe correspondence from his wife or children. But when Helen returned to her desk after lunch, she couldn't stop herself from checking the classified materials log. It was a thick binder where anyone removing documents from secured areas had to sign their name, the date, the file number, and the destination. She flipped to today's date. Dr. Kellerman had signed out nothing. She went back through the past week, nothing, past month, only 2 entries, both for materials he'd taken to meetings in Building 2, and both properly signed back in within hours. Helen closed the binder and sat very still. Maybe he'd forgotten to log the portfolio. Maybe it contained only unclassified materials. Maybe she was creating problems where none existed. But the possibility that something was wrong had planted itself in her mind like a seed, and she couldn't uproot it no matter how hard she tried. That evening, Helen stayed late to finish transcribing notes from the morning meeting. Most of the building had emptied out by 6, leaving only the dedicated engineers who regularly worked 12-hour days. She was proofreading her work when she heard Dr. Kellerman's door open. She glanced up, expecting him to bid her good night as he usually did, but instead he walked quickly toward the elevators without acknowledging her presence. He still carried the leather portfolio, and his normally composed demeanor seemed slightly agitated. Helen made a decision that she would later describe to investigators as pure instinct. She grabbed her purse and followed him, keeping enough distance that he wouldn't notice. The elevator doors closed before she reached them, so she watched the floor indicator lights, ground floor. She took the stairs, her sensible heels clicking against the concrete steps, and emerged into the humid evening air just in time to see Dr. Kellerman's blue Chevrolet pulling out of the parking lot. She ran to her own car, a second-hand Ford Falcon, and followed. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that this was a massive invasion of privacy, that she'd feel mortified tomorrow when she realized she'd stalked her boss for no reason. But something stronger than logic drove her forward, some deep-seated sense that the ordinary world she knew had cracked open to reveal something darker underneath. Dr. Kellerman drove north on Interstate 45, away from the suburban neighborhoods where most NASA employees lived. Helen maintained a careful distance, grateful for the heavy evening traffic that provided cover. After 20 minutes, he exited near the port area, where warehouses and industrial buildings created a landscape of shadows and harsh streetlights. This wasn't a residential area. There was no reason for anyone to be here after business hours unless they were up to something they didn't want witnessed. Helen's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She should turn around. She should go home. Instead, she followed Dr. Kellerman's car as it turned into a nearly empty parking lot beside a warehouse that looked abandoned. She killed her headlights and parked behind a rusted shipping container, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Through the growing darkness, she watched Dr. Kellerman exit his car and look around carefully. He stood beside his vehicle for nearly 5 minutes, checking his watch repeatedly. Then another car appeared, a dark sedan with no distinctive markings. It parked 30 feet from Dr. Kellerman's Chevrolet, and a man stepped out. Even at this distance and in the poor light, Helen could see he was shorter than Dr. Kellerman, stocky, wearing a plain gray suit. The two men didn't shake hands or greet each other in any friendly way. They simply stood facing each other like business associates, conducting a transaction. Dr. Kellerman opened his portfolio and removed what looked like documents. The other man produced a large envelope from inside his jacket. They exchanged items quickly, professionally, the entire interaction taking less than 30 seconds. Then both men returned to their respective vehicles and drove away in opposite directions. Helen sat frozen in her car long after both vehicles had disappeared. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe Dr. Kellerman was selling his car and meeting a potential buyer. Maybe he was involved in some kind of personal business deal. Maybe the classified materials log was irrelevant, and she was connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But the secrecy of the location, the careful way they'd exchanged items, the complete absence of normal human interaction, it all pointed to something covert. She drove home in a daze, barely registering the familiar streets of her neighborhood. Her small apartment felt too quiet when she entered, and she stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights, trying to decide what to do. If she was wrong, if she reported suspicious behavior based on nothing more than a feeling and some circumstantial observations, she could destroy Dr. Kellerman's career and reputation. NASA took security seriously, but false accusations were also taken seriously. She could lose her own job for making unsubstantiated claims against a senior engineer, but if she was right, if Dr. Kellerman was passing classified information to someone, possibly to Soviet intelligence, then every moment she delayed was another moment of betrayal against her country, against the space program, against everything NASA represented. The weight of that possibility pressed down on her like a physical force. Helen didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed watching shadows move across her ceiling, replaying every interaction she'd ever had with Dr. Kellerman, searching for signs she might have missed. He'd always been pleasant, professional, competent. He spoke fondly of his family. He bought cookies for the office every Christmas. He'd helped her understand complex technical terms when she first started working for him. Nothing about him suggested treachery, except that he'd exchanged documents with a stranger in a deserted parking lot after smuggling them out of NASA in an unlogged portfolio. That single fact couldn't be explained away, no matter how many innocent scenarios she constructed. By morning, Helen had made her decision. She would report what she'd seen, knowing it might cost her everything. She arrived at the Manned Spacecraft Center even earlier than usual and went directly to the security office before she could change her mind. The guard on duty, a middle-aged man named Frank, who always had a kind word for the secretaries, looked up in surprise. "I need to speak with someone in security," Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's urgent. It's about possible classified information being compromised." Frank's expression shifted from friendly to professional in an instant. He picked up his phone, spoke briefly to someone, and within 3 minutes, Helen was sitting in a windowless conference room with two men in dark suits who identified themselves as NASA security investigators. Their names were Morrison and Chen, and they listened without interrupting as Helen recounted everything. The open filing cabinet, the unlabeled envelope, the missing log entries, the meeting at the warehouse. When she finished, the two men exchanged glances. Morrison, the older of the two with grey hair and a weathered face, leaned forward. "Miss Martinez, you understand that what you're describing is an extremely serious accusation." "I know," Helen replied. "That's why I almost didn't come, but I saw what I saw." "And you're certain Dr. Kellerman removed documents from his office?" Chen asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "I can't be absolutely certain what was in the portfolio," Helen admitted. "But he carried it to a secret meeting where he exchanged something with another man. And there's no record of him checking out classified materials, even though he had access to them in his office that morning." Morrison nodded slowly. "We'll need you to write down everything you've told us, every detail you can remember. Times, locations, descriptions of the other man, the vehicles involved. Can you do that?" Helen spent the next 2 hours in that conference room, writing her statement with painstaking care. She described the warehouse location, the approximate time of the meeting, the physical appearance of the unknown man, the make and model of his sedan, though she hadn't caught the license plate. She included details she wasn't sure mattered, like the fact that Dr. Kellerman had seemed agitated, that he'd forgotten his usual coffee routine, that the manila envelope had been tucked between proper folders as if hidden. While she wrote, she could hear Morrison and Chen making phone calls in the hallway, their voices low and urgent. She caught fragments of conversation. FBI liaison, possible HUMINT breach, need immediate surveillance authorization. The acronyms and jargon of intelligence work washed over her, making the situation feel suddenly very real and very frightening. When she finally finished her statement, Morrison returned and read through it carefully. Then he looked at her with an expression that might have been respect. "Miss Martinez, you did the right thing coming to us. I need you to understand that from this moment forward, you cannot discuss this with anyone. Not your friends, not your family, not your co-workers. You'll continue working as normal, and you'll treat Dr. Kellerman exactly as you always have. Can you do that?" Helen nodded, though the thought of facing Dr. Kellerman and pretending everything was normal made her stomach clench. "What happens now?" "Now we verify your information and determine if further investigation is warranted," Chen said. "If what you've reported is accurate, you've potentially prevented significant damage to national security. But we need to move carefully. Espionage investigations require patience and precision." Helen returned to her desk just before 9, her hands still trembling slightly. "Doctor." Kellerman arrived at his usual time, greeting her with his customary smile and asking if she'd had a pleasant evening. She managed to return the smile and make small talk about a television program she claimed to have watched, when in reality she'd spent the night terrified and sleepless. He seemed completely normal, betraying no sign of stress or suspicion. Either he was an exceptionally skilled actor, or he genuinely believed his activities had gone unnoticed. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Every time Dr. Kellerman's phone rang, Helen wondered if it was his contact. Every time he left his office, she wondered if he was retrieving more documents to smuggle out. She typed letters and memos like an automaton, her mind elsewhere, imagining FBI agents watching the building, following cars, setting traps. 3 days later, Morrison appeared at her desk, just as she was preparing to leave for the evening. He asked if she could spare a few minutes, his tone casual, but his eyes intense. They walked to the same conference room where she'd given her statement, and this time 2 additional men were present. One introduced himself as Special Agent Reeves, from the FBI's Houston field office. The other, wearing a military uniform with colonel's insignia, simply nodded without offering a name. "Miss Martinez," Reeves began, sitting across from her, "we've conducted preliminary investigation into your report. I want to thank you for your vigilance and your courage in coming forward. What you observed was indeed a dead-drop meeting between Dr. Werner Kellerman and a Soviet intelligence operative." The words "Soviet intelligence operative" hit Helen like a physical blow, even though she'd suspected it. Hearing it confirmed made it terrifyingly real. She found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "So he's actually a spy." "We believe, Doctor. Kellerman has been operating as a Soviet agent for approximately 18 months, Reeves continued. "The man you saw him meet is a KGB officer working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate in Houston. Your observation allowed us to confirm surveillance we'd already initiated, based on communications intelligence." The colonel leaned forward, his expression grave. "Doctor, Kellerman has had access to some of the most sensitive propulsion data in the Apollo program," he said. "Combustion efficiency calculations, fuel composition formulas, engine design specifications. If the Soviets have obtained this information, it could significantly accelerate their own lunar program. We're working to determine exactly what's been compromised." Helen felt sick. She thought about all the documents she'd filed, all the memos she'd typed, all the conversations she'd overheard. How much of that had ended up in Soviet hands? How many engineers' brilliant work had been stolen and copied? How much had America's advantage in the space race been eroded by one man's betrayal? "What happens now?" she asked. "Will you arrest him?" "Not yet," Reeves said. "This is where we need your continued cooperation. We want to control what information Dr. Kellerman receives from this point forward. We'll feed him selected documents, some genuine but outdated, some deliberately misleading. This way, we can study Soviet intelligence methods and potentially identify other operatives in their network." "But Dr. Kellerman cannot suspect that we know about his activities. That means you must continue working for him as if nothing has changed." Helen stared at him. "You want me to keep being his secretary? To pretend I don't know he's a traitor?" "We understand this is difficult," Morrison interjected, "but you're in a unique position. You have legitimate access to his office, you know his routines, and you've already demonstrated excellent observational skills. If Dr. Kellerman realizes he's under investigation, he'll either flee or shut down his activities, and we'll lose the opportunity to exploit this situation." The colonel added, "You'd be serving your country, Miss Martinez. What we're asking requires real courage, but the intelligence value could be substantial. You'd be working directly with the FBI, helping to protect national security at the highest level." Helen thought about her father, who'd served in the army during World War II and never missed an opportunity to express his pride in American freedom. She thought about the astronauts who risked their lives every time they climbed into a spacecraft, trusting that the engineering calculations were accurate and untainted by enemy interference. She thought about the thousands of men and women at NASA who dedicated themselves to reaching the moon first, not for glory, but because they believed in scientific achievement and democratic values. "I'll do it," she said. "Tell me what you need me to do." Over the following weeks, Helen Martinez became an unlikely player in a high-stakes counterintelligence operation. The FBI installed listening devices in Dr. Kellerman's office with her assistants, tiny microphones hidden in the spine of a technical manual and inside his desk lamp. They taught her how to observe without being obvious, how to note when files were accessed, how to identify which documents he photographed using a miniature camera they'd discovered hidden in his briefcase during a controlled search of his office while he was at lunch. Helen learned that Dr. Kellerman wasn't actually Werner Kellerman at all. He was Anatoly Volkov, born in Leningrad, trained by the GRU Soviet military intelligence, and inserted into the United States through West Germany in 1960, with a carefully constructed legend. The real Werner Kellerman had died in a car accident in Pennsylvania in 1948 and Soviet intelligence had appropriated his identity, creating documents and backstory that would withstand all but the most thorough investigation. Volkov had spent years establishing his cover, earning degrees under the stolen name, building a reputation, waiting for the opportunity to penetrate America's most valuable technological programs. The FBI showed Helen photographs of Volkov's contact, identifying him as Viktor Petrov, officially listed as a cultural attaché at the Soviet consulate, but actually a senior KGB officer running multiple intelligence operations in Texas. They explained how dead drops worked, how Volkov would photograph documents using special film that could capture dozens of pages in a tiny package, how he'd signal readiness for a meeting by adjusting the position of a potted plant visible from the street, how Petrov would retrieve the intelligence and transmit it to Moscow Center via encrypted diplomatic cables. Helen's role was to create opportunities. She would mention, casually, that certain documents had arrived and been filed. She would ask Dr. Kellerman, innocently, about technical terms in reports that the FBI wanted him to access. She would schedule his meetings in ways that gave him time to photograph materials the counterintelligence team had carefully prepared, documents that looked genuine but contained subtle errors, outdated calculations, or deliberately misleading specifications. The psychological strain was immense. Every morning, Helen would greet the man she knew to be a Soviet agent with a smile and a cheerful good morning. She would bring him coffee, type his letters, organize his files, all while knowing that FBI agents were listening to every word, that surveillance teams were tracking his movements, that analysts were studying his patterns. She felt like she was living in two worlds simultaneously, the ordinary world of a NASA secretary going about her daily tasks, and the shadow world of espionage, where nothing was what it seemed. 2 months into the operation, something unexpected happened. Dr. Kellerman, Helen still thought of him by his assumed name, called her into his office one afternoon. His expression was troubled, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he'd somehow discovered the surveillance. But instead, he gestured to a chair and said something that would haunt her for years. "Helen, I want to thank you for your excellent work," he began, his accent seeming slightly more pronounced than usual, as if stress were eroding his carefully practiced American speech. "You've been a tremendous help to me, and I want you to know I appreciate your dedication. In this line of work, it's easy to forget the human element, to get so focused on technical problems that we forget about the people who make everything possible." Helen managed to nod and murmur her thanks, wondering where this was going. Dr. Kellerman continued, his eyes distant, looking past her toward the window. "Sometimes I wonder if what we're doing here really matters. We're trying to reach the moon before the Soviets, but why? What does it prove, really, except that we can spend more money and resources than they can? Meanwhile, children go hungry, cities crumble, people suffer. Is technological achievement worth the cost?" It was the most philosophical Helen had ever heard him speak, and it disturbed her because it sounded almost genuine, as if the man behind the false identity was momentarily showing through. She found herself responding before she'd thought it through. "I think it matters because it shows what people can accomplish when they work together towards something bigger than themselves. The engineers here aren't doing this for glory. They're doing it because exploration is part of human nature. We've always looked at distant horizons and wanted to know what's beyond them." Dr. Kellerman studied her for a long moment, and something flickered in his expression that might have been regret or sorrow or simply fatigue. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly. "Perhaps some things are worth the sacrifice." He seemed to shake himself and return to his usual professional demeanor. "Anyway, I just wanted to express my appreciation. That's all. You can get back to work." Helen left his office feeling unsettled. That night, when she met with Agent Reeves for her regular debriefing at a safe house the FBI had set up in a nondescript apartment complex, she recounted the conversation. Reeves listened thoughtfully, taking notes, then said something that shifted Helen's perspective. "People who become spies are often idealists who've been redirected," he told her. "Volkov probably believed, at least initially, that he was serving a greater good, that by stealing American secrets he was helping his country compete fairly against a richer, more powerful adversary. But espionage is corrosive. It requires constant deception, constant vigilance, constant loneliness. You can never be yourself. You can never truly connect with anyone. After years of that, many spies start to question whether the cause they serve is worth what they've sacrificed. "Is that supposed to make me feel sorry for him?" Helen asked, hearing the edge in her own voice. "He's betraying people who trust him. He's helping a totalitarian regime that crushes freedom wherever it takes root. He's made choices, and those choices have consequences." "You're absolutely right," Reeves agreed. "I'm not suggesting you should sympathize with him. I'm saying that understanding what motivates someone makes it easier to predict what they'll do next. If Volkov is starting to have doubts, he might make mistakes, or he might try to defect. We need to be prepared for either possibility." The operation continued through the spring and into the summer of 1967. Helen watched as the documents she helped plant in Dr. Kellerman's path made their way into Soviet hands, each one designed to lead their engineers down unproductive paths or reinforce incorrect assumptions. The FBI was conducting what they called a deception campaign, using Volkov as an unwitting conduit to feed Moscow false intelligence about American propulsion capabilities. Meanwhile, the surveillance had expanded. The FBI had identified 3 other individuals in contact with Viktor Petrov, though none worked at NASA. One was a contractor at an aerospace company in California, another a professor at the University of Texas who specialized in rocketry mathematics, and the third, a technician at a military installation near San Antonio. The Bureau was building a map of the entire Soviet intelligence network in the Southwest, planning a coordinated takedown that would roll up multiple operations simultaneously. Helen learned details about espionage tradecraft she'd never imagined existed. She learned about one-time pads, sheets of random numbers used to encrypt messages that were theoretically unbreakable if used correctly. She learned about microdots, photographs reduced to the size of a period that could be hidden in plain sight in ordinary correspondence. She learned about brush passes, where 2 people would exchange items while passing each other on a crowded street, the transfer taking less than a second. She learned about surveillance detection routes, circuitous paths designed to reveal anyone following you. The shadow world had its own language, its own rules, and Helen found herself becoming fluent in both. On August 3, 1967, everything came to a head. Dr. Kellerman had been provided with a particularly valuable seeming document, technical specifications for a new engine design that promised significant improvements in fuel efficiency. The FBI had crafted it carefully, making it look authentic while ensuring that any engineer who tried to build based on these specs would encounter catastrophic failure. It was too tempting for Volkov to resist. Helen watched as he photographed the document in his office, his miniature camera clicking softly. She'd been instructed to step out for a coffee break at precisely this time. Giving him privacy he thought was secure, but that was actually being monitored by 3 different surveillance systems. When she returned 20 minutes later, he was at his desk, working on calculations. The document returned to its folder as if he'd never touched it. That evening, surveillance teams followed him to a different location than his usual dead drop. This time, he went to Herman Park, a large public space where families picnicked and children played. He sat on a bench near the reflecting pool, reading a newspaper, apparently just another professional unwinding after work. Viktor Petrov appeared 10 minutes later, carrying a bag from a nearby bookstore. He sat on the same bench, leaving space between himself and Volkov, but close enough to exchange items. The FBI had decided this would be the moment. As Volkov passed the microfilm to Petrov, 8 agents moved in simultaneously, cutting off all escape routes. Helen wasn't there to witness it, but Reeves described it to her later. The shocked look on Volkov's face as he realized he'd been caught. Petrov's attempt to swallow the microfilm before being restrained, the crowd of park visitors scattering in confusion as federal agents swarmed the area. Within hours, all 4 members of the spy ring were in custody. Petrov, protected by diplomatic immunity, would be expelled from the country within days. The others, including Volkov, faced espionage charges that could carry the death penalty. News of the arrests would be carefully managed, released to the press in a way that emphasized FBI effectiveness without revealing the extent of NASA's penetration or the methods used to identify the spies. Helen learned about the arrests when Morrison called her at home that evening. She sat on her couch in her small apartment, phone pressed to her ear, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. It was over. The man she'd worked beside for 3 years was gone, revealed as an enemy agent, and she'd played a crucial role in his capture. She should feel triumphant, but instead she felt exhausted and oddly sad. The next morning, NASA security briefed the Manned Spacecraft Center staff about a security incident involving Dr. Kellerman, providing minimal details, but emphasizing that there was no immediate threat to the facility or its programs. Helen's name was never mentioned. As far as her colleagues knew, FBI investigation had uncovered the spy through routine counterintelligence work. Her role remained classified, known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals. Helen returned to work, assigned temporarily to a different engineer, until NASA could hire Dr. Kellerman's replacement. The transition was strange. She found herself missing the familiar routine, even knowing what she now knew. She'd spent 3 years building professional rhythms with someone who didn't really exist, and dismantling those patterns left her unmoored. 3 weeks after the arrests, Helen was called to a meeting in Building 1, NASA's administrative center. She was escorted to an office where she found herself facing a group that included Morrison, Agent Reeves, the unnamed colonel who'd first briefed her, and 2 men she didn't recognize wearing suits that screamed Washington. One of them, gray-haired and distinguished, introduced himself as Deputy Director Carlson from FBI headquarters. "Miss Martinez," Carlson began, "I've reviewed the full case file on Operation Moonshade, which is what we've designated this investigation. I want to personally commend you for your extraordinary service to national security. You demonstrated courage, discretion, and intelligence far beyond what anyone could have expected from a civilian who received no formal training in counterintelligence operations." He opened a folder and continued, "The information we obtained through the controlled operation you facilitated has proven invaluable. The Soviets attempted to build a prototype engine based on the specifications we provided, and it failed spectacularly during testing at their Baikonur facility. Their engineers are now questioning other technical intelligence they've received, which creates uncertainty in their entire lunar program. Additionally, we've identified contacts and methods that will enhance our defensive posture against Soviet technical intelligence collection for years to come." Helen listened, still processing the fact that her actions had reached all the way to Soviet launch facilities in Kazakhstan. Carlson pulled a medal from the folder, holding it up. "This is the Intelligence Star, the CIA's highest award for exceptional service. You're not CIA, obviously, but similar recognition from the FBI would be a matter of public record, and we need to keep your role classified for your protection and for operational reasons. This medal will remain in your file at FBI headquarters, and you'll never be able to display it or tell anyone about it. But I want you to know that your government recognizes what you did." Helen stared at the medal, a silver star against a black background, and felt tears prick her eyes. She'd never sought recognition, had never imagined herself as any kind of hero. She was just a secretary who'd noticed something wrong and had the courage to report it. But the weight of what she'd accomplished settled over her like a blanket. She'd helped protect the space program, had helped maintain America's technological edge, had helped ensure that when astronauts eventually walked on the moon, they'd be doing so with untainted calculations and genuine American ingenuity. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I just did what seemed right." The colonel spoke for the first time, his voice gruff but not unkind. "That's exactly what courage is, Miss Martinez. Doing what's right even when it's difficult, even when you're afraid, even when no one will ever thank you publicly for it. You embody the best of what this country represents." The meeting concluded with instructions about maintaining operational security. Helen was told she could never discuss the details of what had happened, that if asked about Dr. Kellerman, she should simply say she didn't know much about the case. She signed additional non-disclosure documents, her signature binding her to silence for decades. Then she was escorted back to her desk, the medal remaining in Carlson's folder, destined for a vault she'd never see. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least to a new normal. Helen continued working at NASA, eventually transferring to a position supporting the Mission Control Team. She was there in July 1969 when Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface, and she felt a fierce pride knowing she'd played a small part in making that moment possible. The propulsion systems that powered the lunar module worked flawlessly, their calculations untainted by enemy deception, their design the product of genuine American engineering brilliance. Anatoly Volkov, the man who'd called himself Werner Kellerman, was convicted of espionage in 1968 after a classified trial. He received a sentence of 30 years in federal prison. In 1978, he was exchanged for 2 American agents captured in Eastern Europe, part of a spy swap arranged through back-channel negotiations. He returned to the Soviet Union and disappeared from public view. His American career nothing but a footnote in intelligence histories that would only be declassified decades later. Helen never spoke to him again after that afternoon when he'd thanked her for her dedication, never got to ask him if he'd really questioned whether the space race mattered or if that had been one more manipulation, one more lie in a life built on deception. She sometimes wondered what became of him, whether he was celebrated as a hero in Moscow or quietly discarded as a failure, whether he ever thought about the secretary who'd unraveled his operation with nothing more than attention to detail and moral courage. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, some KGB files were opened to researchers. A historian working through documents about Soviet technical intelligence operations discovered a memo from 1967, written by a senior officer and translated from Russian. It described the failure of a recruited agent, codenamed Prometheus, who had successfully penetrated the American space program but had been compromised through unknown means. The memo noted that Prometheus had expressed doubts about his mission in the months before his arrest, suggesting possible psychological weakness that the KGB should have detected and addressed. The historian, unaware of Helen's role, published an article about Soviet espionage targeting NASA, mentioning Prometheus as a successful operation that was unfortunately terminated prematurely. The article briefly noted that American counterintelligence had somehow identified the agent, but provided no details about how. Helen read the article in 1998, sitting in her living room long after she'd retired from NASA, and she smiled at the academic language that couldn't capture the reality of what had happened. She thought about that morning with the empanadas, about the open filing cabinet that had started everything, about the split-second decision to follow Dr. Kellerman to that warehouse, about all the small moments of courage that had accumulated into something significant. History would never record her name in connection with this story. Her family never knew what she'd done. Her friends at NASA never understood why she sometimes seemed distracted or troubled during those months in 1967. But she knew, and the handful of intelligence professionals who'd worked the case knew, and that was enough. Helen Martinez died in 2015 at the age of 74, taking her secrets with her as she'd promised. Her obituary mentioned her long career at NASA, her support of the Apollo program, and her love of baking empanadas for friends and family. It said nothing about espionage or counterintelligence or the medal that still rested in an FBI vault with her name on it. Her children cleaned out her apartment and found nothing unusual among her belongings, no hints of the shadow world she'd briefly inhabited, no evidence of the crucial role she'd played in one of the Cold War's quieter victories. The few intelligence veterans who remembered Operation Moonshade would occasionally mention it in classified briefings as an example of how ordinary citizens, through vigilance and courage, could make extraordinary contributions to national security. They would emphasize the importance of security awareness, the value of trusting one's instincts, and the necessity of having mechanisms in place for people to report suspicious activity without fear of reprisal. But they could never use Helen's name, could never tell the full story of the young secretary who'd noticed something wrong and had refused to look away. In the end, the space race that had seemed so urgent, so all-consuming during those Cold War years, became historical curiosity for younger generations who couldn't quite understand the intensity of the competition between superpowers. The moon landings, once symbols of ideological triumph, became achievements celebrated for their scientific and exploratory value rather than their political significance. The thousands of engineers and scientists and support staff who'd made it all possible faded into obscurity, their individual contributions lost in the collective accomplishment. But on July 20th, 1969, when Helen stood in mission control and watched the grainy television images of Armstrong descending the lunar module's ladder, she knew something the jubilant crowd around her didn't know. She knew that the calculations powering that moment, the fuel mixtures and thrust vectors and combustion sequences that had carried those men across 250,000 miles of space, were pure and untainted. She knew that Soviet intelligence had tried to corrupt American ingenuity, to steal and sabotage and level the playing field through deception rather than honest competition. And she knew that she had stood in the gap, an ordinary person doing an extraordinary thing, protecting the dream of reaching the moon from those who would have poisoned it with lies. The story of how a NASA secretary accidentally exposed a Soviet spy is a reminder that history's pivot points often turn on small moments and unlikely heroes. It wasn't brilliant detective work by seasoned agents that unraveled Anatoly Volkov's operation, though their expertise was crucial once Helen brought her observations to their attention. It was a woman with empanadas who noticed an open filing cabinet, who trusted her instincts even when logic suggested she was being paranoid, who chose courage over convenience and truth over complicity. In a conflict defined by vast military budgets and sophisticated technology and globe-spanning intelligence operations, victory sometimes came down to individual conscience and the simple act of paying attention. The Cold War produced countless such stories, most of which will never be told because the participants are bound by oaths of secrecy or because the records remain classified decades after the events they describe. Somewhere in government archives, files slowly yellow and deteriorate, containing accounts of ordinary people who made impossible choices, who lived double lives, who carried secrets that bent their souls under the weight of perpetual deception. Helen Martinez's file is among them, a testament to a brief moment when the ordinary and the extraordinary intersected, when a secretary became a spy catcher, when attention to detail and moral courage combined to protect something larger than any single person. As the Cold War faded into history and new conflicts emerged with different characteristics and different threats, the lessons of that era remained relevant. The importance of security awareness, the vulnerability of even the most protected organizations to insider threats, the psychological toll of espionage on both those who practice it and those who combat it. These themes continued to resonate. Intelligence professionals still study cases like Operation Moonshade, still analyze what went right and what could have gone wrong, still marvel at the unlikely chain of events that began with a woman carrying breakfast pastries into an office and ended with a spy network's dismantlement. Helen Martinez never sought glory or recognition. She never wrote a memoir or gave interviews or sought to profit from her experience. She simply returned to her life, carrying the knowledge of what she'd done as a private burden and private pride. In her later years, when the Cold War had ended and the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had dissolved into history, she sometimes wondered if it had all mattered, if the small victories and quiet heroics had truly made a difference in the grand sweep of events. But then she would remember standing in mission control, watching humanity's first steps on another world, knowing that those steps were built on truth rather than lies, on genuine achievement rather than stolen secrets, and she would smile and know that yes, it had mattered very much indeed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.